Hello there! Have you ever tried learning a foreign language? If you have, then you'll know that translating between languages isn't as simple as just swapping one word out for the other, and then boom, you got a sentence. No, there's a lot of context and a lot of rules that need to be considered when translating between languages, and today I'm going to cover some of those rules and certain quirks in different languages that you may find interesting.
How many liberals does it take to change a log bulb?
First of all, lots of people do know about this. Grammatical gender and number is a thing that features in many languages. We have it not really grammatically baked into English, but like in certain words like stewardess versus steward, and so on. Certain languages, such as the Romance languages, those are languages derived from Latin, and Germanic languages, Somali, Arabic, so many across the world, include grammatical gender and number, which is baked into sentence structures in such a way that, so the word for the, or the word for a, or the word for cold, and adjectives like that have to be modified to agree with the noun's grammatical gender and number. So I'm going to use an example from the famous hit Ed Sheeran song, The A-Team. So the song starts like this. White lips, pale face. In French, that would be lèvres blanches, visage pâle. If we translate that literally, that means lips, white, female plural, face, pale, masculine singular. That was I'm trying not to read from the script and it's really difficult. Anyways, the default for the word white is blanc. But it takes these different forms in the form of like a 2x2 grid. So, blanc, blanc, blanche, blanche. And for pâle, it is pâle, 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 pâle. Usually in speaking you can't really tell the difference. It usually may change the sound of certain syllables because of the addition of E, which makes consonants actually audible. And so not only is grammatical gender and number important when using adjectives, it's also important when you're using articles. So articles in English are a/an, which is the indefinite article, and the, which is the definite article. There isn't much variation between these things, but in French you have un and une for masculine and feminine respectively, and le for masculine, la for feminine, and le for plural. In other languages such as Spanish, you may have el, la, las, and los. Grammatical gender can also be important in certain contracted phrases such as of the, or from the, or to the, or at the, because in French, if you have a plus le, so at the masculine, then that gets contracted to or. If you have from the masculine, de plus le, then it gets shortened to du. So here's some examples of it being used in French. Je vais au supermarché. Tu veux quelque chose? Ouais, une baguette, du lait et des haricots. D'accord, à plus tard. Formality is a pretty common concept in English. It changes the way you speak in order to fit the context. So you wouldn't email your teacher saying,
Yo, what's crack-a-lackin', G-Dog? Like the animal. Unfortunately, your main man, that's me, has been caught lacking and cannot hand in that homework you set for today. My bad, major cringe alert. Peace out. Much love, the Jimbinator.
And you probably wouldn't message your friend saying,
To whom it may concern, it is with great sorrow that I announce that I will be unable to attend this week's gathering. I hope my absence shall not impart great pain on your psyches. Go, run free, my little darlings, for I shall be present, not in the flesh, but in spirit. Yours truly, Barquifius.
Now, there are some interesting uses of register in different languages. Romance languages tend to have different pronouns depending on whether or not you want to be formal with the person you're speaking to in the second person. So for example, in French, there are two pronouns for you, tu and vous. Tu is used for singular and for informal contexts. Vous is used for singular formal and plural singular or informal. So for example, here are some different contexts where you may use one or the other. Je sors avec les filles ce soir. Tu viens?
Bonjour, monsieur. Est-ce qu'il y a quelque chose que je peux faire pour vous aider?
It can also change the possessive pronouns in a sentence. Qual é o teu nome, meu amigo? Qual é o seu nome, o senhor? It also changes the verb conjugation use, as these are two different pronouns with different conjugations for verbs. Tu comes una manzana. Usted come una manzana. In Polish, you don't actually use the second person to refer to someone you are not familiar with or you want to be formal to.
Czy pan pali or czy pani pali?
Means does sir or miss smoke? If you were talking to your friend, you would say,
Je te parles.
in Japanese, register can have such an effect that it actually changes the first person pronoun you use, the word for I. Watashi is the most general first person pronoun, but for more casual settings, men and boys may use boku or ore. Watashi is still used in casual settings by girls. In extremely polite situations, watakushi is used by men and women. Verb conjugation can also be affected. Although Japanese doesn't conjugate verbs depending on the subject, the must form of a verb is tend to be more formal and used in general usage, whereas the ru form of the verb is considered the dictionary version, and it's more sort of used in an intimate context, or used by children who have very basic levels of Japanese. Japanese also has an extensive honorific system, where honorifics such as sama, san, kun, and chan are used to refer to people of different genders and of different levels of formality.
Hello, it's just me, Jimbo, and Post, as I stare off into space in that last frame there. Just thought I'd give some extra explanation for Japanese honorifics. So they follow the last name of the person you're talking to. Sen is kind of the general honorific. Sama is the more formal version of sen. Kun is from like a higher to lower status or of the same status, like close friends or children and so on. And the next step beyond that in the other direction is chen, which is used for people you're either very close to or for young children, for example. It's also interesting to note that in certain contexts people use their actual name instead of the first person pronoun when speaking. This is again used in very casual, informal or kind of intimate usage, as well as by children who are learning Japanese.
Party? Cool that sounds.
Let me ask you a question. Why does Yoda sound weird to an average English speaker? Interesting, that is. An SVO language, English is. The reason is he's obviously using a different sentence structure, but we can still understand what he's saying. The reason is English is an SVO language. SVO standing for subject, verb, object. In an average clause, you will have a subject, which is a thing doing an action, the verb, the action it is doing, and the object being the recipient of the action. It's important to note, however, that English is not always SVO per se, but can also be SVC, ending in a complement, a word that is used to describe the subject. Objects can also be indirect or direct. An example of a direct object clause is I, stroke, sprinkles. I being the subject, stroke being the verb, and sprinkles being the object. So that was an example where sprinkles is the direct object. But what about if sprinkles is the indirect object?
An example of an indirect object sentence would be I give some milk to Sprinkles. I being the subject, give being the verb, some being a quantifier, milk being the direct object, to being a preposition, and Sprinkles being the indirect object.
Some milk is the direct object because that is what I am giving. Sprinkles is the indirect object because I'm giving some milk to her. You're a good kitty cat, even though you threw up on my carpet this morning. You're a good kitty cat. But what if I was to say Sprinkles is cute? This isn't really SVO, but cute can't be the object because that's an adjective, not a noun. So that clause falls under the SVC, subject, verb, complement structure. That is because the verb to be is considered a copular verb, or you would have maybe heard of it in primary school as a linking verb. One last bit of grammar before we start comparing languages, and that is pronouns. Pronouns are smaller words that are used to replace nouns in a clause. If we didn't have them, communication would be janky and annoying and difficult. For example, hey Adam, does Adam know Tracy and David? No, Adam doesn't know Tracy and David. Okay Adam, okay. Once context is established, the use of pronouns can make communication far easier. Right, now time to look at some other languages. Romance languages tend to follow an SVO clause structure, but when using a pronoun for the direct or indirect object, that structure becomes SOV. For example, je t'aime mon amour. Me llamo Jimbo. I seu chapego. I seu chapego. In Japanese, the word order is generally SOV, but it's not strictly SOV. It can also be OSV, so long as the verb is the word that ends the clause. But how could that work? So, for example, I could say
私はスプリンクルズを撫でます
or
スプリンクルズを私は撫でます
But how does that work? Well, Japanese uses what's called markers. The markers ga, wa, and o. Ga for the subject, wa for the topic, which also doubles up as the subject, and o for the object. But sometimes in speech, watashi wa is dropped because from context you can clearly tell who you're talking about. Well, what about copulars? Let's use the example from before.
スプリンクルズは可愛いです
Notice how there's no o particle. because kawaii is the complement and des is the copula. Because of these markers, I know who or what is doing the action and who or what is receiving the action without needing to rely on word order. Let's look at another language. Polish uses what's called grammatical case. Grammatical case is when nouns are modified to show their role in a clause and their grammatical function. Kind of like how Japanese uses topic, subject, and object markers, Polish uses different cases to show how different nouns relate to one another. For example, the Polish word for book is książka, but to say, I read a book, you say
Czytam książkę.
Notice how there's a difference in that ending there. The difference in the ending is because book is in the instrumental case. The way you would translate the instrumental case into English is by using words such as using or with. Okay, so do we have anything similar in English? Well, we sort of do, in the uses of different pronouns for depending on whether or not that pronoun is the subject or the object of a verb. For example, you wouldn't say, me read book, or do you want to come with I to the store? That's because I is the subject pronoun and me is the emphatic or disjunctive pronoun. It doesn't make sense because those pronouns are used in different contexts depending on how they relate to the verb. Although they essentially mean the same thing, they serve different grammatical functions.
You're not the leader! A and the completely change the meaning.
I mentioned articles earlier in this video, and to English speakers they're a pretty intrinsic part of speech. I remember thinking to myself as a kid, if you had to ask someone to define a word, and then they had to define the next word after that and again, if you reach words like the, how could you possibly define that? You just have to know what that means. Well, sort of, but a lot of languages don't actually have that word. You see, in English we have 3 articles, although a/an basically serve the exact same function. The being the definite article, and a/an being the indefinite article. The is when you're talking about a specific example of a noun, whereas a/an is used when you're talking about a general example of a noun. For example, Jenny has a goldfish. The goldfish is called Herbert. Is used because no goldfish has been mentioned prior to this moment in the conversation. The is then used in the second sentence because we have already specified what exact goldfish we're talking about. We're talking about the goldfish Jenny owns. Not just any one of her goldfish, this specific goldfish is called Herbert. Many Indo-European languages have articles, and some use them more often than others. Take French for example. Je suis allé au Sénégal il y a 2 mois. The word au, as we have talked about previously, means at the or to the. So literally translated, that means I went to the Senegal 2 months ago. Also take this example. Je voudrais du pain, s'il vous plaît. We've already covered the word du, and it's the masculine form of the or from the. In English, you could say I want bread or I want some bread. In French, that's not an option. You have to use the article. I want some of the bread. Not because you want to take a piece of bread, but maybe you're taking some bread from the general concept of bread. I'm not too sure how that specifically works. The equivalent of this phrase would be I want some bread. Du can be also used as a bit of a quantifier, but you wouldn't say je voudrais quelques pains. The definite article is also used in French for general ideas or concepts. For example, la cyberintimidation menace les jeunes français. La is used because cyberintimidation is a general concept or phenomenon. But there are also some cases where the definite article is not used where it would be used in English. For example, elle est ingénieure. When describing someone's occupation, you almost use it as an adjective and you don't have the indefinite article like you would in English. She is engineer, not she is a engineer of the many engineers in the world. Some languages are even more hardcore with their use of articles. Take Greek for example, where you have to put a definite article in front of someone's name when referring to them in the third person. For example,
Έχεις δει τη Μαρία?
That phrase literally translates to, have you seen the Maria? Also, let's look at our example that we used earlier in the video in European Portuguese when describing register and formality. Qual é o teu nome, meu amigo? That literally means, what is your name? Italian also has a similar system.
Quella è la tua macchina. Questa è la mia.
An interesting thing to note is that in both Portuguese and Italian, possessive adjectives and possessive pronouns are the same. So that means the words for my, your, her, his, and so on are the same as mine, yours, hers, and his. What about languages without articles? Both Japanese and Polish don't use articles. Polish has an extensive case system, as we mentioned in the last section. As a general rule, languages with good case systems generally don't have articles. This rule follows for most of the Slavic languages, Russian, and Latin. But that rule is not absolute. Take Greek, for example, which has both articles and case, and Mandarin Chinese, which has neither. Usually grammatical case provides enough information to do without articles.
时事，诗事，诗事。 事事事实实施。
Minor differences in pronunciation can lead to big differences in meaning in certain languages. Accents and diacritics can be used to show how certain letters or syllables should be pronounced in certain languages in writing. They also can provide other information about what the language used to look like. Take French for example. The verb to eat is manger. Mange is a present tense conjugation of that verb, whereas manger is the past participle. So in English that would be like eat or eats and eaten. Without that accent, they would serve a different grammatical function, and sound different as well. Also, French has the circumflex accent, which shows that an S used to be next to the vowel in Old French. For example, hôtel used to be hostel, and hôpital used to be hospital. Spanish has an N tilde to show what used to be a double N, but the tilde in Portuguese is used for nasal vowels. Certain Slavic languages also have accents above S and C, which would equivalent to sh and ch, and other sounds like that. Vietnamese has a very interesting writing system which is derived from the Latin alphabet. It uses different accents and diacritics to show different tones, as it is a tonal language like Mandarin and Cantonese. Speaking of tones, you may know that Mandarin Chinese also has 4 tones and a neutral tone. Rising, falling, high, and low/falling rising. They are shown in the pinyin romanization of Chinese, but this is not the official script that Chinese is written in. Cantonese has 6 tones but no neutral tone, and those tones are, and I'm just going to read off a script here, high, low mid to high, mid, low mid to low low mid, and low mid. Cray. As I mentioned before, there are other languages that also use tones, such as Thai and Vietnamese. Even though it may be difficult for non-native speakers to pick up the differences between tones in speaking, the level at which tones can affect meaning in certain languages can be really interesting. Take the story written in classical Chinese, Lion-Eating Poet in the Stone Den. The story comprises of different characters which are pronounced as sh or sh in modern Chinese with different tones. It tells the story of a poet that kills 10 lions in a market and brings them back to a stone den. Even though it's pretty much unintelligible in modern day Mandarin or Cantonese, it's still really cool. It's like the Chinese equivalent of police, 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 police. Japanese is not a tonal language, but sometimes vowel length and pitch can be important to a word's meaning. For example,
ame, ame,
and
biru, and biru.
even though English is not a tonal language, intonation can still be important to meaning. For example, stressing certain words can show that you're trying to specify a certain meaning. For example, let's use the sentence, I didn't eat a baby. 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 The different uses of intonation show which part of the sentence we are doubting. Also, rising intonation can be used for questions. For example, are you going to the supermarket? Notice how the pitch of my voice changed. Although in English we say are you for questions instead of you are, in French you can also just use rising intonation and the statement and the question will be identical, although you can also use words like est-ce que and reversing the word order. Tu vas au supermarché. Tu vas au supermarché?
And is
Third person plural, present indicative. There you go.
but Romans go home is an order, so you must use the
Imperative.
Now we are saving best for last here. In primary school you probably learned that there are 3 tenses, past, present and future. Well, arguably that's not all there is. Tense and aspect can be combined to show different forms of a verb. For example, I ate is the simple past in English. I have eaten is the past perfect tense, and that shows that the action has been completed. I had eaten is the pluperfect tense. It's sort of like a double perfect and is used to describe an event that happened further on in the past. And then there's the imperfect or continuous past. I used to eat, I was eating, I have been eating, I had been eating, and so on. These all describe something that used to take place over a concerted period, or something that used to be part of your habit, or something that was continually happening at the point at which you're describing the situation in the past. There are 2 forms of the present in English, the simple and the continuous. I eat and I am eating. The simple present can be used in different contexts, particularly to show habit or what you do in your routine, like I go upstairs, I take a shower. The present continuous shows what you're doing right now. For example, I'm filming a video. I wouldn't say I film a video because that's slightly strange out of context. It's happening right now, so I say I'm filming a video. There's the simple future, I will eat, the continuous future, I will be eating, the perfect future, I will have eaten, and the near future, I'm about to eat. There's also the conditional tense, which is also more of a vague tense. It shows that an event depends on something else happening. It can be used with if clauses and modal verbs, the modal verb would in English. It can also be used like the imperfect, to show different habits in the past. For example, I would eat that food if it tasted nice, or when I was younger, I would eat carrots. There is also the subjunctive mood. It isn't really used much in English anymore, but it's very big in Romance languages. For example, God save the Queen, lest we forget, may he be at peace, and also, if I were you. So, what is conjugation? Conjugation is when you change a verb according to different pronouns, different moods, different senses, and so on. For example, he eat and I eats are wrong conjugations. Conjugation in English is pretty simple. For regular verbs, you remove the to from the infinitive, for example, to eat, and then you add an s for the pronouns he, she, it, and so on. You add an en for the past participle to that stem, eaten, for example, and ed to show the simple past. Oh no, actually, that's an exception. Let's say, walk. No, walkin', you can't do walkin'. Walkin' doesn't make sense. Okay. No, you can't do go. You see, this is the problem with English. The rules are simple, but it never follows the rule. Okay. Given. Gave. No, okay, what verbs can I find? Stopped? Stoppin'? Either way, most of the time it's fairly easy. But French.
To conjugate a regular verb in the present, which is already a stretch given the sheer number of regular verbs in French, check its infinitive ending to see if it's an ER, IR, or RE verb. For the present, simply remove the two-letter ending and add the correct ending that corresponds to the correct subject pronoun. But don't add T to an RE verb stem in the third person if the stem ends in D, which usually does. Wow, great word conjugating. And oh, what's that? These conjugations don't even sound that different to each other most of the time apart from to improve. Well, suck it up, princess. Now for past tense. Make sure you choose your flavour of past correctly and use the same step for removing the two left letters from the infinitive and adding these endings. For constructing the past participle, add these endings for these respective verb endings, and now you can use the auxiliary verb avoir for the past perfect. Psych! It isn't as easy as that, because if the verb is a document as a mandarin verb or a reflexive verb, you're going to have to be using être, and that means the past participle has to agree with the subject in grammatical gender and number, and oh, look, it's future time. In French, you can use aller as an auxiliary verb, followed by the infinitive for the near future, or you can use the simple future by using the infinitive for er and ir verbs, and the infinitive minus e for the re verbs as the future stem and adding these endings. You can also use the imperfect endings on the future stem to form the conditional, and use a variety of other combinations of these things I've mentioned to form different compound tenses. The subjunctive is used far more in French and in other Romance languages. In French, the subjunctive usually follows opinions and negative verbs followed by que, as well as impersonal verbs, emotional language, and expressions of doubt or uncertainty. For example, il ne crois pas que tu dois être là, as opposed to il ne croit pas que tu dois être là. A regular subjunctive stem is followed by removing the ent from the third person plural conjugation of the verb, and adding these endings that correspond to these pronouns. The usage makes sense. Let's have a gander, shall we? Does this phrase need to be followed by the subjunctive? Je regrette que, je crois que, je ne crois pas que. Sometimes for some conjugations, you can't even tell a verb is in the subjunctive, whereas for others you can definitely tell because they're incredibly irregular, particularly the verbs you actually use on a regular basis.
There are other tenses which have luckily fallen out of use in French, such as the simple past, or so-called the past historic, and the imperfect subjunctive. What's interesting is that French doesn't really have a continuous tense. If you really want to stress that you're currently doing the action, you can say je suis en train de. But most of the time you'll just use the simple present even if you're currently doing the action. So why are there all these conjugations when you can't even hear the difference in speech? Well, I'm not too sure why that's the case in French, but in other Romance languages, the differences in pronunciation for each of these conjugations are distinct enough for you to be able to just say the conjugated verb without needing to use the pronoun. For example, te amo, falo portuguese, mangio spaghetti. What about other languages? Japanese has a past and non-past system of tenses, but you can add a bunch of endings to verbs that change their meaning. I'll just use a few basic examples. Tabemasu, tabemashita, tabetai,
Tabetakunai.
tabetakata, tabetakunakata. These endings are usually seen as separate words in English, such as auxiliary verbs like to want to. All this conjugation and tense stuff can be a bit of a pain. What if there was a language that doesn't have any conjugation or tense, and where the verb just stays as a verb? Behold, the Chinese languages. Because the Chinese languages like Mandarin and Cantonese have a logographic writing system, you can't really add inflections onto the end of words, otherwise you have to add a bunch of new characters for all words that basically mean the exact same thing. So, in speech, they're all pronounced the same. Tense is usually given through context, but there are also aspect markers. Aspect describes the nature of the action taking place, whether it is being completed, whether it is ongoing, and so on and so forth. We've already seen this described through tenses such as the past imperfect, past perfect, and so on. Let's look at Mandarin Chinese. In Mandarin Chinese, there is an aspect marker, le, which indicates perfective aspect. It shows a completed action or a change in a situation. This has a similar effect as what we do in English when we change different forms of the verb to have and then add a past participle to show perfective aspect. For example, I have eaten, I had eaten, I will have eaten. All of those are different forms of past and future, but they show perfective aspect. Le can be used to convey a similar meaning. 我吃了蒸包.
昨天我吃了蒸包.
过 is another aspect marker that shows an action has been experienced in the past, similar to another past perfect, but more to do with I have done this before.
我妹去过中国，明天我会这张包。我在这张包，明天我会在这张包。
Well, that was just some of the many cool grammatical features of the world's languages. I hope you enjoyed, and I can guarantee you that in about 2 years' time I'll make another video and it'll be completely unrelated to this one. Bye now!